In the summer of 1883, in a dusty Wyoming town, a father made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He sold his 19-year-old daughter, Eliza Monroe, to a rancher named Nathaniel Garrett in exchange for a horse. What that drunken father didn't understand was that the lonely widower with 3 sons would treat his daughter like the treasure she truly was. Not as property, but as a person with a soul made of fire and gold. This is their story, the tale of a young woman the world called worthless, and the man who quietly proved she was worth more than any fortune. And as you step into that dusty street with them, if stories of second chances and redemption speak to you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and share it, so more people can hear what became of the girl who was traded for a horse. Clearwater baked beneath a high Wyoming sun, the whole town wrapped in a haze of dust and heat. Outside the saloon, John Monroe leaned on the hitch rail with a bottle in his hand and eyes yellowed by drink. His shoulders slumped in that careless way of a man who has stopped counting the cost of his choices. Across the street, a chestnut mare pawed at the dust, her hide gleaming like burnished copper in the harsh light as she shifted her weight, patient and strong. Nathaniel Garrett, a widowed rancher with 3 young sons, stood near the general store and studied her steady stance for a long moment before lifting his gaze to the man who was selling more than an animal without fully realizing it. "That mare's worth more than the mouths I'm feedin'," John rasped, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand as if to clear away the taste of his own words. "You could use a woman's hand at your place. Take the girl. She's 19, reads, cooks, sews. The horse for her. Fair trade." Nathaniel's jaw set as he looked at him. "I'm not buying cattle," he said, the sentence low and tight. John laughed, a cracked, cruel sound that matched the broken veins in his cheeks. "Call it what you like," he slurred, shrugging as if a daughter were no more than another tool to barter away. Through the window of the general store, Eliza Monroe sat by the light, mending a torn shirt with neat, careful stitches, completely unaware that her worth was being measured in reins and coin across the street. Nathaniel hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders, as the mare snorted and the coins in his palm clinked together with a metallic whisper that sounded too much like a verdict. He knew the bargain had been spoken wrong, knew that John Monroe was so drunk he barely understood what he was offering, thinking to trade his daughter for another man's horse and too far gone to see that no decent man would take that deal straight. Nathaniel's conscience turned hard inside him as he realized that if he walked away now, the girl would still be sold, only to someone worse, someone who would not hesitate to treat her exactly as her father had described. When Monroe stumbled back into the saloon, boasting to anyone who would listen about the trade he claimed he'd made, Nathaniel quietly crossed the street. The chestnut mare remained tied where she had been all along, reins looped to his own wagon post. The drunk hadn't even noticed that he'd never actually taken her. Inside the store, boots scraped across the floor as John's shadow filled the doorway like a storm cloud. "Pack your things," he slurred, swaying slightly. Eliza looked up from her mending, the needle paused in midair. "You sold me?" she whispered, barely able to push the words out. "That horse'll plow," he muttered, refusing to meet her eyes. "You only eat." She gathered her 2 books, her mother's locket, and the few clothes that still fit, folding them into a worn canvas bag that had once been her mother's sewing satchel, and with every careful fold she gathered what remained of her dignity as well. When she stepped outside, Nathaniel waited near the wagon with his hat in his hand, his posture respectful rather than possessive. "Miss Monroe," he said softly, "I'm Nathaniel Garrett." She met his eyes with a level gaze that hid the shaking in her chest. "I understand, Mr. Garrett," she answered, her voice steady but faint. He tipped his head once in a gesture that felt more like a vow than simple politeness. "You're not bought, ma'am," he said quietly. "Not by me." The wind rose and lifted the dust between them like a veil. Coins lay forgotten somewhere in the dirt where Monroe had dropped them, and the mare stamped once, steady and calm between the traces. Somewhere inside that swirling silence, a single question began to form, one that would define both their lives. What Nathaniel chose to do next would silence the town of Clearwater for months to come, and would echo far beyond that hot summer day. By noon, the wagon rolled north out of Clearwater, the town shrinking behind them until even the saloon's swinging doors were nothing more than a memory that creaked shut like the end of a bad chapter. Eliza sat stiff-backed beside Nathaniel Garrett, her hands folded in her lap as she watched the road unspool in front of them, through waves of shimmering heat. The chestnut mare trotted steadily between the traces, the only familiar thing in a world that had just traded Eliza's name for reins, and every jolt of the wagon seemed to hammer in the truth that her life had been bartered away. Nathaniel glanced at her once, taking in the tight set of her mouth and the white knuckles on her bag, then fixed his eyes back on the horizon. "You can ride if you'd rather," he said quietly after a stretch of silence, his voice low enough that it almost blended with the creak of the wagon. "She's yours now," Eliza replied, the words thin but steady, "like me." He frowned at that, the muscles in his jaw working as if he were chewing on something bitter. "Nobody owns anybody, Miss Monroe," he said at last. "Not out here." They rode on without speaking for a while, the wagon wheels grinding over the hard-packed earth, the harness leather squeaking, and the wind carrying the dry sweetness of sagebrush across the open land. Now and then he passed her the canteen without comment, and she drank carefully, keeping her fingers away from his and holding herself as if touch itself were dangerous. By evening they reached a dry creek bed and stopped to make camp, the sun slipping lower and painting the sky in streaks of red and gold. Nathaniel climbed down first and began gathering wood, moving with the efficient rhythm of a man used to doing without help, while Eliza spread a blanket near the wagon and set her small bundle beside it. He offered her jerky and biscuits from his pack, and she accepted with a small nod and a quiet word of thanks, the first fragile thread of civility between them. When darkness fell, coyotes began their lonely song beyond the hills, the sound thin and wild in the distance. Nathaniel sat by the fire, staring into the flames while the light carved quiet lines into his face, the lines of a man who had seen too much loss and learned to bury the ache under work and silence. Eliza sat on the blanket near the fire with a book open in her lap, the words barely visible in the flickering light as she tried to read herself away from the sharp edges of the day. When the flames settled to coals and the air turned cooler, she climbed into the wagon and lay awake, listening to the wind sift through the sage and the soft cough of the mare as she shifted her weight. Nathaniel didn't know what to say, so he said nothing, but when he finally lay down on the ground beside the wagon, he turned his face outward toward the darkness, keeping silent watch until dawn as if the simple act might make up for the way her day had begun. The next day, just as the sun tipped west, the Garrett ranch came into view, rising from the land with a kind of quiet stubbornness. A modest clapboard house stood above a dry creek, its porch sagging a little and the shutters hanging half askew, the fence mended in so many places that it told its own story of storms weathered and money stretched thin. Beyond the house stretched pasture the color of copper dust, dotted with grazing cattle and framed by the shimmer of distant mountains that hemmed in the sky. Eliza studied it in silence, seeing the peeling paint and the weary boards, but also the way everything looked like it had been built by hands that meant to stay. The house wasn't fine, but it was honest. Nathaniel reined the wagon to a stop, all the miles behind them settling into the quiet space between his words. "It's not much," he said, almost apologetic, "but it keeps the wind off and the roof don't leak." She nodded, her voice soft but sure. "A sound roof's worth more than painted trim," she replied. He helped her down. From the wagon, his grip steady but careful, and the boards underfoot felt solid beneath her boots. The step creaked but held. A child's ball lay in the dust near the porch, sun-bleached and forgotten, a small relic of lives interrupted. Through the open doorway drifted the faint scent of bread gone stale and wood smoke that hadn't burned in days, the smell of a house that had been waiting more than living. Inside, the rooms felt still, too still, as if laughter had been folded up and put away with the last clean linens. 3 small beds lined the wall in the corner room, and a woman's bonnet hung from a peg, its ribbons faded by time and dust. Eliza traced a finger over the dust on the mantel and said quietly, "You built this yourself." "With Sarah," he answered, the name hanging between them like breath in cold air. "She died birthing the youngest." Eliza set her bag down by the door, feeling the echo of that loss settle around them. "You want supper made?" she asked, meeting his eyes without flinching. "If you're able," he replied. "Boys'll be in from chores soon." He showed her the small spare room off the hall, a space that was clean, plain, and private. The door shut with a solid click when she pulled it closed, and the key turned smooth in her hand. For the first time in years, a lock answered to her rather than being used against her, and the sensation was so strange she stood still for a moment, just feeling the weight of it. As dusk deepened, she smoothed the coverlet on the narrow bed and stood in the quiet room, the scent of soap and cedar steadying her like a hand on her shoulder. It was not comfort yet, but it was safety, and that was more than she had dared to hope for. Evening settled across the prairie like cooling embers, the sky softening from orange to blue as shadows lengthened across the yard. From the kitchen window, Eliza watched 3 figures crossing the dusty ground toward the house, dust-covered and sunburned and loud with the kind of wild energy that only boys carry home from work. Thomas, tall for 12 and already trying on the seriousness of a man, led the way with a practiced swagger. James, 9, trailed behind, swinging a rope in idle circles as if the day's chores hadn't tired him at all. William, 6, clutched a crooked wooden stick he called his rifle, turning every step into a small adventure. When they spotted their father standing beside a stranger in the doorway, the noise died as if someone had closed a door on it. Nathaniel cleared his throat. "This is Miss Eliza Monroe," he said steadily. "She'll be helping around the house." Thomas's eyes narrowed, the grief of his mother's absence and the loyalty to his father sharpening into suspicion. "We don't need help," he said. Eliza met his look without flinching. "Good," she replied calmly. "Then we'll get along fine, because I don't plan on doing anything you're already doing well. Yourself." James studied her curiously. "Can you read?" he asked, his voice full of hope he tried to hide. "I can," she answered, "and if you ask polite, I might teach you more than that." William pressed close to Nathaniel's leg, half hiding behind him as he peered at the woman who had just stepped into the shadow of their late mother. Eliza smiled gently in his direction. "I don't bite," she said with a lightness that softened the tension. "I only burn biscuits sometimes." That earned a faint grin from James, and even Thomas's mouth twitched before he caught himself and straightened his shoulders again. Inside, the kitchen soon smelled of stew and wood smoke. Eliza set bowls on the table while Nathaniel washed up at the basin. The boys watched her quietly as if measuring what kind of woman had stepped into their mother's place, and whether she meant to stay. When she served them first instead of herself, Thomas frowned and muttered, "Pa always eats first." Eliza did not miss a beat. "Then Pa's due a rest," she said evenly as she set a bowl in front of him. "Tonight, we'll let the young men go first." Nathaniel entered just in time to see Thomas hesitate and then obey, curiosity winning out over stubbornness. He said nothing, only took his seat, bowed his head, and listened as Eliza murmured grace with a simple sincerity that made the room feel less empty. After supper, when William yawned so wide his eyes watered, she drew a small book from her satchel and held it up. "Your father said you boys liked stories," she said, glancing toward the table where Nathaniel sat, pretending not to listen. William climbed close, his eyes heavy but eager, while James leaned forward with his elbows on the table, and Thomas lingered near the doorway, pretending to tidy his things while he kept one ear turned toward her. Eliza smiled faintly, opened the book and began to read, her voice weaving the words into the dimly lit kitchen until the lamplight pooled gold around them. By the time the last line fell, William had fallen asleep against her sleeve. James's head rested on his arms with contentment, and Thomas stayed very still, his gaze lowered as though the story had reached further into him than he meant to let it. Nathaniel watched quietly from the door, the tight crease of his brow unfolding for the first time in years as he realized the house no longer sounded so empty. Weeks passed, marked not by calendars but by chores and small mercies, by sunrises seen through kitchen windows and the steady beat of work done side by side. Morning light spilled across the table where Eliza kneaded dough, her sleeves rolled high and her hair damp with sweat, while the smell of yeast and wood smoke drifted through the house, chasing away the long-kept scent of loneliness. The boys learned her rhythms before they learned her history. William, the youngest, brought her eggs each morning, sometimes whole and sometimes broken, his small hands proud either way. James hovered nearby with his primer, reading haltingly while she worked, letting her gentle corrections turn his stumbles into progress. Thomas, who had once glared at her across the supper table, began mending fence beside her without being asked, his silence shifting from hostility to partnership. When William tore his only good shirt on a nail, he came to her in tears, clutching the fabric like a wound. She took the cloth from his shaking hands and said gently, "I'm not your ma, William, but I can still fix it." The needle flashed in the lamplight, and within minutes the rent was gone, the tear hidden so neatly it was hard to remember it had ever been there. The boy stared at her, eyes wide, then wrapped his small arms around her waist with a sudden burst of trust. For a heartbeat she froze, unused to being held. Then she returned the hug, careful and certain, feeling something inside her loosen. Later that week she found James hiding in the barn with his book open to a page he couldn't master, the words swimming in front of his eyes. "I'm stupid," he muttered, anger aimed at himself. Eliza sat beside him on a bale of hay, the dust motes turning in the slant of light. "You're learning," she said gently. "That's what smart people do. They keep going." From that night on, they read together after supper, her voice low and patient while his confidence grew with each line he conquered. By the 6th week, even Thomas began to soften. When a ranch hand made a crude remark about the woman Garrett bought, it was Thomas's fist that struck first, his loyalty snapping into action before his mind had time to catch up. Nathaniel heard the commotion and came running, but by the time he got there, the ranch hand was already backing down, one hand to his jaw, and his eyes lowered. Eliza knelt by Thomas, wiping blood from his knuckles with a damp cloth. "Next time," she said quietly, her tone firm but proud, "words are sharper than fists." He nodded, shamefaced but with his eyes shining with the fierce certainty that she was worth defending. That night, as she finished mending by lantern light at the kitchen table, Nathaniel paused in the doorway, his shadow stretching long across the floorboards. "You've done something I couldn't," he said. She looked up, thread between her fingers. "What's that?" she asked. "Made this house feel alive again," he answered, and he didn't wait for an answer, just tipped his hat and left her to the soft hum of crickets and the steady pulse of belonging that she was finally starting to feel. The last of summer burned itself out across the plains, the days shortening, the nights cooling, and Nathaniel found his ranch humming smoother than it had in years. The ledgers balanced more often than they didn't, the boys laughed again in the yard, and the quiet in the house no longer sounded like loss but like rest. He had never planned to care about the woman he'd brought home that summer. Need had made him practical, not sentimental. Yet every time he passed the open kitchen door and saw Eliza bent over her work, sleeves rolled, and hair escaping its braided bun, something inside him eased in spite of himself. He had built his life out of routine, dawn rides, hard labor, and early nights where exhaustion replaced grief. But lately he caught himself pausing in those doorways, just watching. She would hum while she cooked, soft tunes without words that threaded themselves through the clink of dishes and the scrape of chairs. Sometimes he heard William giggling at her stories, or James reading aloud in halting confidence while she corrected him gently, or Thomas trying to disguise the pride in his face when she praised his handwriting. The house had grown warm again, not just from fire, but from her steady hands and patient presence. One evening he found her in the barn, tending the chestnut mare, the same horse that had once been the price put on her life. The animal had cut its leg on barbed wire, and Eliza knelt beside it, whispering as she worked, her hands steady and sure. "You're worth more than he ever knew," she murmured to the mare. "We both are." Nathaniel stopped in the doorway, something tightening in his chest as he watched her. She hadn't noticed him yet, and lamplight pooled over her hands, gilding her hair and the mare's flank in the same warm glow. He had seen beauty before, but not like this, quiet, earned, and unself-conscious. When she finally looked up and caught him watching, he meant to say something of depth, words that matched the weight of what he felt, but instead he only tipped his hat and said, "You've a way with hurt things." Her smile was faint, uncertain, yet grateful. "I've had practice," she replied. That night he sat at the kitchen table long after the lamp burned low, his ledger open before him while the numbers blurred on the page. He thought about her courage, her calm, and the way she laughed with the boys, and realized that for the first time since Sarah's death, he wanted to live rather than simply endure. He closed the book, leaned back, and whispered into the stillness, "She could leave tomorrow if she wanted. God help me, I hope she doesn't." Saturday came bright and windless, the kind of day when all of Clearwater found its way to town in wagons and on horseback. Eliza rode beside Nathaniel in the wagon, a basket of eggs and mended shirts at her feet, her posture straight but composed. She wore a freshly pressed calico dress, plain but neat, and her hair, tied with a blue ribbon, caught the sunlight like thread spun from corn silk. They had not been to town together before, and though her face remained calm, her pulse beat quick under her collar as they rolled past familiar buildings that now saw her in a very different light. Nathaniel noticed, though he kept his hand steady on the reins, and did not comment. The general store buzzed with voices and creaking floorboards until the moment they stepped inside, when conversation dropped to a hush, sharp enough that they could hear the door hinge sigh behind them. Behind the counter, Mr. Webb, the storekeeper, cleared his throat but didn't offer his usual greeting. his eyes flicking between Nathaniel and Eliza. At the far end of the room, Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, crisp in lace and judgment, turned toward them, her gaze narrowing. She let her words fall like stones, making sure everyone heard. "Well," she said loudly, "looks like Garrett finally brought the girl he bought." A few nervous laughs rippled through the room, thin and uneasy. Eliza's cheeks burned, but she held her ground, fingers tightening on the basket instead of lifting to shield her face. Nathaniel's voice came low and steady, like thunder building far away. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, "you watch that tongue." Her smile was sweet poison. "I only speak what everyone knows," she replied, tilting her head slightly. Nathaniel took one step closer, his boots thudding like punctuation on the worn boards. "My wife manages my home, raises my sons, and keeps this ranch running," he said, letting each word land. "She reads Latin, balances accounts better than I ever could, and delivered a breech calf last week that'd be dead under lesser hands. You tell me, ma'am, what do you do besides ruin decent mornings?" The store went still as a graveyard at midnight. Even Mr. Webb froze with his scoop halfway through a measure of flour. Eliza's heart hammered, but she stayed silent, letting Nathaniel's words stand. Her dignity spoke louder than any defense she could have offered. Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and then shut again without reply. Nathaniel laid coins on the counter, took the sack of sugar Eliza had come to buy, and turned to her with his expression gentler. "Ready to go home?" he asked. She nodded, her voice soft but sure. "Home sounds good," she said, and she meant it. When they stepped back outside, the whispering began again, but it sounded different this time. Some nodded as they passed, a few even smiled, small, cautious, but respectful. Eliza lifted her chin to the sunlight and let it warm her face in a way that felt earned rather than borrowed. If you've stayed with this story so far and you believe, like Nathaniel just showed, that nobody is truly worthless, it helps more than you know when you share this video or subscribe, because that simple act whispers back to the world that these kinds of stories matter. Autumn came early that year. Morning frost glazed the pasture fences, and the sound of hammer and saw echoed from the barn where repairs never seemed to end. By then, everyone in Clearwater understood that although Eliza still answered to Miss Monroe in town, she had settled into the Garrett ranch in every way that mattered and had earned the name in all but ceremony. She rose before dawn, brewed coffee before Nathaniel came down the stairs, and always left enough heat in the stove for the boys' breakfasts. When the roof leaked after the first cold rain, she climbed the ladder herself with her dress hem pinned up and a hammer in her hand, laughing that the sky was just testing her work ethic. By winter, no one doubted she could outwork half the men in the county. But it wasn't only her labor that marked her worth. She taught James his sums and Thomas his letters well enough that even the schoolteacher commented on their improvement. She showed William how to plant winter greens, telling him, "You feed the soil like you'd feed a friend, and it'll feed you back when times are lean." When Nathaniel worried over the ledgers, frowning over the columns by lamplight, she stayed up beside him, candlelight catching the gold in her hair as she traced a finger down the numbers. "You're paying too much for feed," she said. "They're adding 10% that isn't yours to lose." He smiled faintly, a mixture of surprise and relief. "Then we'll stop losing," he replied. The ranch began to prosper, the weight of debt falling away like old bark from a tree that had finally found good water. By the time the snow melted, they had saved nearly $40, almost the exact sum her father had once taken for her. Nathaniel didn't mention the coincidence aloud, but he wrote the number carefully in the margins of his ledger, as if to mark the turning of something sacred. That spring, a mare foaled early and struggled, and Eliza knelt in the straw with her sleeves rolled and her hands steady as she guided the slick, trembling newborn into the world. When the creature let out its first wavering cry, Nathaniel swore he'd never seen anything so close to grace in his barn. "You've saved us again," he said, his voice thick. Eliza brushed sweat from her brow. "Just did what was needed," she answered. That night over supper, the boys argued softly about names for the foal. Thomas suggested Fortune, and Eliza smiled at that. "Seems fitting," she said. "We've all found a bit of it." Nathaniel, watching her laugh with the children, realized that the ranch no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to them, all of them, and most of all to the woman who had turned work into love and hardship into home. Summer returned, soft and golden over the plains, the harvest coming early, and the fields heavy with promise. As the Garrett ranch stood quiet in the dusk, every fence mended and every roof sound. For the first time in years, Nathaniel felt the peace of a man whose burdens no longer outweighed his blessings. One evening, he found Eliza sitting on the porch rail, her hands folded loosely in her lap as the day's heat lingered in the air and the scent of cut hay floated on the breeze. The boys had gone to bed, and the house glowed behind her with lamplight and the slow rhythm of a family settling into sleep. "I never thanked you," Nathaniel said, stepping onto the porch. She turned, half smiling. "For what?" she asked. "For everything. For this," he said, gesturing toward the home they had built from silence and work and shared days. Her voice was quiet as she answered. "You gave me a place to stand," she said. "I just learned how to fill it." He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, searching for words he had never been good at. "I brought you here for help," he admitted, "but you've become more." Eliza looked at him steadily. "I came here as property," she said. "You made me feel human again." The words hung in the air like a prayer neither dared to claim. Nathaniel cleared his throat. "Sarah would have liked you," he said. Eliza nodded gently. "I hope so," she replied. "She was kind," he said, "but she was never strong like you." Eliza's eyes softened. "Maybe she didn't have to be," she said. "Maybe that was your lesson for me." A long silence settled between them, comfortable now instead of uncertain. Fireflies drifted above the grass, and somewhere in the dark the chestnut mare stamped softly in her stall. Then Nathaniel spoke again, his voice lower. "Eliza, I don't know how to do this right," he said, "but I know what I want. Not as a debt, as a choice." He hesitated and then stepped closer. "May I court you properly?" he asked. Eliza's eyes glimmered in the lantern glow. "You're asking my permission?" she said, almost surprised. He nodded. "It's the only way that matters," he replied. Her lips trembled into a smile. "Then yes," she said. "Yes, you may." Nathaniel reached out, his rough hand brushing hers, and in that still moment she leaned toward him. The kiss they shared was soft and sure, two lives meeting in quiet agreement, nothing hurried, nothing owed. When they drew apart, the porch light flickered and the stars above seemed to shimmer brighter. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. Love, real and earned, had found its place between them. 18 months passed. The Garrett ranch weathered 2 winters and came out stronger than ever. The barn was freshly painted, the fences stood straight, and laughter had become part of the landscape, as common as the wind. Eliza moved through her days with quiet confidence, wife, mother-to-be, and the heart of everything that grew under that wide Wyoming sky. On a late summer afternoon, as she was measuring fabric on the porch, a shadow fell across the yard. A horse stumbled into view, its rider swaying with a hat pulled low, dust clinging to every ragged thread of his clothes. John Monroe, her father, had returned. He reined up at the gate and squinted toward the house. "Eliza," he slurred, "there's my girl." The smell of whiskey carried on the air even from where she stood. Eliza's hands froze on the cloth, the years between, them collapsing into a single heartbeat of disbelief. Nathaniel stepped out beside her, his jaw tightening. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone flat. John spat in the dirt. "Help yourself, more like," he said. "You got a good deal out of me. That girl's worth 10 horses now from what I hear. I figure I'm owed a share." The boys had gathered near the porch steps, silent and watchful, their faces hardening with a protective instinct they didn't bother to hide. Eliza drew a slow breath and moved down toward the yard, her posture steady and her voice even. "You sold me, Father," she said, "for a horse, and you spent that horse's life in whiskey." John's eyes narrowed. "You can't talk to me that way," he snapped. "I'm your blood." "No," she replied, her tone like iron wrapped in grace. "You're my past, that's all." He tried to push past Nathaniel, but Thomas, now a tall young man, stepped forward to block him, his shoulders squared. "You best leave, mister," he said. For a flicker of a second, the drunk man seemed to see what he had thrown away, a family whole and proud without him, standing together. Eliza looked at him, no hate and no pity in her gaze, only finality. "You gave me away like I was worthless," she said softly. "He gave me a life worth living. We're done here." John Monroe's face twisted, caught somewhere between anger and shame. Then he turned his horse, wobbling in the saddle as he rode away from the gate and the life he had never bothered to build. Nathaniel said nothing, only stood with his hand resting lightly on Eliza's shoulder. The boys watched until the figure disappeared over the ridge. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Nathaniel asked quietly, "You all right?" Eliza nodded, her eyes bright but steady. "Yes," she said. "For the first time, I truly am." Spring returned to Clearwater, gentle and green, washing the land clean of the year before. The Garrett Ranch, once a quiet mark on the horizon, now thrived like a living promise. Fields were tilled, fences stood straight, and laughter spilled from the open windows of the house. When the church bell rang that Sunday, folks turned to see Nathaniel and Eliza Garrett step down from their wagon. It had been 6 months since they'd wed, simple vows spoken at the small church on the hill, and the town hadn't stopped talking since. But the whispers that once carried judgment had softened into something closer to respect, even admiration. Eliza wore a pale blue dress she'd sewn herself, the same shade as Wyoming sky after rain. Nathaniel walked beside her with his hand steady at the small of her back, his pride visible but quiet. The boys followed in clean shirts with their hair combed and their boots polished nearly to ruin. Inside, the congregation rose with the hymn, and afterward the churchyard filled with handshakes and Sunday chatter. Mrs. Henderson approached first, her lace parasol trembling ever so slightly. "Mrs. Garrett," she said, her voice caught between pride and apology, "I was wrong about you." Eliza smiled softly. "Most of us are, until we learn better," she said. There was a pause. Then Mrs. Henderson's face relaxed, and she reached out her hand. Eliza took it. "We all deserve second chances," she added. The gesture broke whatever frost lingered between them. Soon others came. Mr. Webb from the store, a rancher's wife who had once looked away, even the town elder. "The Garrett Ranch is the finest in 3 counties," the elder said, "and that's down to both of you." Nathaniel tipped his hat. "Couldn't have done it without her," he replied. Children tugged at Eliza's skirts, begging for stories. She had begun teaching Sunday lessons after service, gathering the town's little ones under the cottonwoods for reading and hymns. When she knelt among them, sunlight struck the gold band on her hand, and the gentle curve of her rounded belly beneath the folds of her dress. Mrs. Henderson watched, her eyes soft now instead of sharp. "She's teaching half the county's children," she murmured, "and I thought she'd brought shame." "No," Mr. Webb said quietly. "She brought dignity." As the Garrett family left the churchyard, the crowd parted easily to let them pass. No one whispered anymore. Heads bowed slightly in greeting, and smiles followed them in their wake. By the wagon, Nathaniel helped Eliza up, pausing just long enough to meet her eyes. "Reckon the town's changed its mind," he said. Eliza shook her head. "No," she answered, smiling. "They just finally saw what was true all along." 5 years later, the sun rose over a changed Wyoming. Where the wind once carried the lonely cry of a land barely tamed, it now echoed with laughter, hammer blows, and the soft chorus of cattle lowing across the valley. The Garrett Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in 3 counties. The barn stood new and tall, and a second house was under construction for the growing family. The garden Eliza had planted in her first year now burst with vegetables and flowers alike, a riot of color against the golden earth that testified to years of careful tending. On the porch, Eliza, now 24, stood watching her children at play. Thomas, 17, helped Nathaniel stack fence posts with the competence of a man grown. James, 14, knelt beside his younger sister, guiding her hand as she traced letters in the dust. William, 11, tried to steady the baby in his arms, laughing as she reached for his hair with chubby fingers. Their mother's voice drifted across the yard, soft but sure. "Careful with your sister, Will," she called. "She's more trouble than she looks." Nathaniel looked up from his work, his hat pushed back and his eyes warm as he watched his wife. He still called her Miss Eliza sometimes, out of habit and deep fondness. "You've turned this place into a kingdom," he said. She smiled. "Only the kind built with calluses and prayer," she replied. A rider passed the gate and tipped his hat respectfully. Every soul in the valley knew her name now, not as the girl who had been sold, but as the woman who had made something holy out of what began in shame. Inside the house, above the hearth, hung a framed photograph taken by a traveling photographer the year before. Nathaniel, Eliza, the boys, and their 2 daughters, all standing proud in front of the ranch house that no longer looked lonely. And in the barn, on a wooden beam above the stall, hung the old saddle of the chestnut mare, the horse her father had once traded her for. On the leather, carved carefully by Nathaniel's hand, were the words, "The horse that brought me everything, 1883. That evening after supper, Eliza stood on the porch once more, the sky deep with orange and violet, as the sun slid behind the far hills. The children's laughter drifted from inside, mixing with the sounds of a house at rest. Nathaniel joined her, settling his arm around her shoulders, in a gesture that still felt like a promise every time he did it. "You ever think about that day?" he asked. She nodded. "Sometimes," she answered, "but not with pain anymore. What he traded away gave us everything." Nathaniel's hand tightened gently around hers. "He thought you were worth a horse," he said, "but you were worth all the gold in California." Eliza smiled, her eyes bright with the reflection of the setting sun. "Worth isn't what you're given," she said softly. "It's what you build." The wind shifted through the fields, stirring the grass like water, and behind them the ranch lights glowed warm against the coming dark. Proof of a love, a home, and a life fully earned. And if this journey from being traded for a horse to building a whole world has meant something to you, Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can hear that no matter where you start, your worth is written in what you choose to build next.